For we are opposed around the world by a monolithic and ruthless conspiracy that relies primarily on covert means.
Connecting the Dots with Dan Happel. Tonight's featured show is Connecting the Dots with Dan Happel. Welcome to the Republic News Network for our live national broadcast. You may call me Kelby, and tonight I'm going to be acting as your moderator. The RNN, which stands for the Republic News Network, has been doing this radio show since 2010, and it's always been a friendly introduction for the people of the United States Corporation. Here we go. It's true. The United States is a federal corporation, and their exclusive jurisdiction is in the District of Columbia. The Republic government was simply a bunch of U.S. citizens that in law don't have access to the Bill of Rights, and they realized they wanted to be Americans as our founders and our law provided each and every one of us. See, we've been hard at work since 2008, and since 2010, we have successfully re-inhabited the original government vacated under Lincoln in 1861. I know, it's hard to understand. Don't worry. We are law-abiding, peaceful Americans and very pro-government, and we love our country. You can consider the Republic members are tired of the corruption that we see every day. See, we found in the law that there is two forms of government here on the land, and we did something about it. We are people. Mothers, fathers, sons, daughters. We have families just like you. We simply found some truths, and now we're sharing these important truths with the rest of the world. So get ready to hear things that sound amazing, and get ready to understand that you too are about to be a part of history. We welcome each one of you to Connecting the Dots with Dan Happel and your Republic if you so choose. But before we go into our broadcast tonight, please bow your head in prayer.
Almighty God, whose blessings are numberless and whose power is infinite, we are grateful for the rich heritage that is ours in this nation of free people. We give you thanks for your manifold gifts to us as we meet for God and for country to carry on the business and the work of this post. May we be honest and open in all our dealings as we seek to serve you, our comrades, and this community. May the programs we undertake and support inspire a love of this nation, a desire that we continue a strong and resourceful people, and a deep respect for those who have paid the ultimate price for the freedom we all enjoy. In Christ Jesus' name, amen.
Well, thank you, and good evening. I want to welcome our guests to Connecting the Dots with Dan Happel, and tonight we have a program with Dr. Peter Pry and Clare Lopez, and it is a discussion about electromagnetic pulse threats and why we've done nothing to harden our electrical grid or our technology to this threat. And this threat exists not only through natural causes from gamma bursts from solar activity, but also it can be triggered by a nuclear explosion at a certain altitude, and we have several countries that have actually threatened to do exactly that, and one of them happens to be North Korea. And so with that, I'd like to first introduce Dr. Peter Pry. And Dr. Pry, would you please give our listeners a little bit of your background so they understand that you really are the preeminent expert on EMP threats in this country?
Well, I wouldn't describe myself as the preeminent expert. That honor belongs to my boss, Dr. William Graham, who's the chairman of the EMP Commission, and who, when I was in elementary school, he was on the defense science team that was sent to investigate the 1962 Starfish Prime high-altitude nuclear test that knocked the lights out in Hawaii. He actually discovered the EMP phenomena and has been working on protecting systems, military systems, ever since 1963. And along the way was the science advisor to President Reagan and ran NASA. But I have learned a lot being mentored by Dr. Graham and by other of the senior scientists who work on the EMP Commission. On my own background, I've worked on. I'm 63 years old now, and I've been working professionally in the intelligence community and the policy community all my professional life on weapons of mass destruction, chemical, biological, cyber warfare, terrorism, nuclear strategy, including EMP attack. And the one that has always worried me the most, and the one that worries Dr. Graham the most, is nuclear EMP attack. I've worked at the CIA on this. I was their senior analyst on EMP for 10 years. I was the senior analyst on EMP for the House Armed Services Committee. I've been the chief of staff of the Congressional EMP Commission and the EMP Task Force for 17 years, trying to get this country protected and trying to educate the public and policymakers that this is a real threat, contrary to some fools that you referred to in our earlier conversation in the mainstream media. I and Dr. Graham, Jim Woolsey, former director of the CIA, Johnny Foster, Dr. John Foster, who was has designed all the nuclear weapons in our current inventory. This is the threat we all take most seriously, and we've dedicated our professional lives. Most of these gentlemen have earned their retirement, but they have come back and have been willing to work in Washington pro bono for free on this issue for 17 years to try to get the country protected. And I am sad to report that we have not yet succeeded. We have raised consciousness a lot, but we have not succeeded. And there's many complicated reasons for that we can go into later. But I'd rather turn the floor over to you so we can address the issues that you would most like to address, and as well as your audience.
Okay. Well, Dr. Pry, one of the things that I wanted to just get into really what electromagnetic pulse technology, what the threat is, how the science actually functions, what an EMP event is caused by, and then how we can really define ways to reduce that threat. So if you just, I know a lot of our listeners, this is the first time they've even heard about electromagnetic pulse threats, and I want to make sure that they understand just exactly how this whole physical phenomenon actually works. So can you kind of describe what EMP really is?
Sure. An EMP can be caused by the sun, naturally, in the form of a geomagnetic storm. It can be caused by man, by a nuclear weapon detonated at high altitude. And it doesn't have to be a precise altitude. Anything above 30 kilometers, between 30 kilometers and 400 kilometers high, basically in outer space. That's a very wide window. If you can get a nuclear weapon up above 30 kilometers, it's going to make an EMP. And then there are non-nuclear EMP weapons called radio frequency weapons that don't have field strengths as powerful as nuclear weapons, and they have a much shorter radius. The non-nuclear weapons typically have only maybe a kilometer radius, whereas a single nuclear weapon detonated at high altitude can cover all 48 of the United States, most of Canada, and a good chunk of Mexico with an EMP field that would destroy electric grids and electronics all within that field. But going back to what you first said, what is an EMP? There's a number of ways of thinking about it. One way is a super energetic radio wave. Think of it as a radio wave, and it's got so much energy in it that it will destroy electronics, power grids, the semiconductors that run computers, the electronics in your car, because there's so much energy in it. Let's dive down a little more deeply into it and start with the EMP that's caused by the sun, which is the easiest one to understand. Geomagnetic storms happen every year. They usually affect nations at high northern latitudes like Finland and Sweden, Russia. Canada was blacked out temporarily in 93 seconds by a geomagnetic storm in 1989. But those run-of-the-mill storms aren't what we worry about. What we are most worried about, the threat to civilization, what some people consider the biggest threat, is the once every 100-year geomagnetic superstorm, like the 1859 Carrington event, which is the biggest geomagnetic storm on record, that we know of. And these are likely to happen every 150 years or so, where you get a particularly powerful coronal mass ejection, non-technical term for it is a solar flare, thrown out from the sun, which is just a big blob of the sun. It's a big blob of ionized plasma that's traveling at 1 million miles an hour that comes out of the sunspots on the sun. And these things come out all the time. We didn't know that until a few years ago, that coronal mass ejections that can cause a Carrington-class geomagnetic storm actually come out all the time. And we're basically in a game of Russian roulette with the sun. And every 100 years or so, one of these things strikes us. We were just missed by one a few years back in 2012, July 25th, 2012, where a Carrington-class coronal mass ejection crossed the path of the Earth and missed us by 3 days. Now, what happens, these blobs of ionized plasma, they're much larger than the Earth. And as I said, they're traveling 1 million miles an hour or faster. And when they strike the Earth, we're not burned to a crisp because God in his wisdom surrounded us within a magnetic field called the Magnetosphere. And the Magnetosphere stops the coronal mass ejection from reaching the surface of the Earth and destroying life with radiation and the high intensity charges and the heat of the coronal mass ejection. But what happens is it deforms the magnetosphere. It causes the magnetosphere to move around. And that is what causes an electromagnetic pulse, natural electromagnetic pulse. Basically, Physics 101, an electromagnetic pulse is caused by a moving magnetic field. And so that's what's happening when you get a natural EMP. It causes the geomagnetic field surrounding the Earth to move around, and you get an EMP everywhere in the world, with this worst-case scenario where we're talking about a geomagnetic superstorm. The EMP would happen everywhere, like it did in 1859. We had just deployed the transcontinental telegraph system, a line from the United States to Western Europe had just been laid by the Great Eastern in 1859, and telegraph systems were located everywhere there were railroads. Everywhere there were railroads, a telegraph line would follow it. And the colonial powers have built railroads and telegraph systems in Africa and India and China and every continent. And in every continent on Earth, in South America, North America, everywhere, the telegraph systems failed. Telegraph keys, which were very robust pieces of equipment, if you look at those things compared to a modern semiconductor, they're really robust hunks of metal. Telegraph keys actually caught on fire or melted. It started fires in telegraph stations. There were forest fires all over the world because the telegraph lines burst into flame from the natural electromagnetic pulse that was caused by the Carrington event. It was so powerful it reached miles down deep into the Atlantic Ocean and burned out the transatlantic cable, and it had to be relayed by the Great Eastern. And a guy, an astronomer who was studying the sun, made the connection because he had seen the coronal mass ejection come out of the sun, and 11 hours later, there was an aurora borealis that was so intense, so bright, that you could read newspapers at night in London by the light from that aurora borealis. And he also made the connection that, hey, this must be what caused all the telegraph systems to fail. Now, fortunately, in 1859, that was horse and buggy age technology. We were not yet an electronic civilization, and we didn't depend on our electric systems for our survival. But we do today. We cannot survive without electricity today. All of our critical infrastructures that sustain life, food systems, water systems, communications and transportation, business and industry, finance, banking, everything depends directly or indirectly on electricity. And if we lost electricity and these systems were destroyed, we would not be able to sustain our population of 325 million people. How many people could we sustain? Well, if you go back to 1900, before we had the modern miracles of electronic technology, we could sustain a population of 76 million people. 76 million people using the critical infrastructures of the 19th century. Coal-fueled locomotives, 75% of the population farmers, well water at every house. That's what we could sustain, 76 million people. Except today, if we were to lose the modern critical infrastructures, we don't have the 19th century critical infrastructures to fall back on. We don't have coal-fired locomotives anymore and by the thousands. We don't have a horse-drawn market economy to feed the cities. Most people don't have well water. And less than 2% of our population are farmers. So that's how come we end up getting such high casualty numbers. You know, the EMP Commission couldn't figure out how, if we lost electricity for a year, do we keep 325 million people alive with no food and no water? Well, you can't. The population has to fall to the natural carrying capability of what's left over, and that's less than 76 million people. It comes out to be about 30 million people, which is only 10% of our current population. So something between 2/3 to 90% of our population would perish in a year from starvation, diseases, and societal collapse. Whether if we had one of these worst-case scenarios where a Carrington event recurs, which almost happened back in 2012. As I said, we were missed by 3 days. Or if a nuclear EMP attack happened, it knocked out the electric grid across the whole country. Or if terrorists or somebody used non-nuclear EMP weapons, numbers of them to cause the grid to collapse, and we had a year-long power outage, which is also possible, even without a nuclear EMP attack, and even without an EMP from the sun. So I'm hoping that explains how EMP works and what the consequences are. It's basically a moving magnetic field. Let me try one more thing before we leave it, just to make sure people kind of understand. Because in your day-to-day experience, there's two analogies I'd like to use. If you know how a lawnmower works, you can understand an EMP, okay? We said an EMP is caused by a moving magnetic field. Well, when you go and you start your lawnmower, you're pulling a cord that spins a cluster of magnets, and that makes a moving magnetic field in the heart of your lawnmower, which makes the electrons in a coil move, which translates into a small electromagnetic pulse that you can see in the form of a spark that runs your lawnmower engine, okay? When a coronal mass ejection happens, when a solar storm happens, that same principle is happening, except you've scaled everything up to the planetary level. And so the energies are much more consequential, or much greater, talking about thousands and thousands of volts. Because when a coronal mass ejection hits the geomagnetic magnetosphere, it's moving around just the way that small magnetic cluster of magnets in your lawnmower is moving around, causing a magnetic field. Another common sense way to think about it is, I'm sure all of your audience members, everyone listening to this program, has had the experience of driving down the highway listening to a radio. Then you drive under a high power line, a high power electric line, and your radio goes out. You lose it temporarily. You come back on the other side and the radio comes back. In the EMP world, we call that upset. Your radio has been temporarily upset by basically an electromagnetic field. Well, imagine if that electromagnetic field that you're driving under is 1 billion times more powerful. It's so powerful that it actually destroys your radio and destroys the electronics in your car, so your car can't even work. Now imagine that localized electromagnetic field is not just localized to that area, but it covers all of North America, most of Canada, all 48 of the states, contiguous United States, plus a good chunk of Mexico, all caused by one nuclear weapon detonated at high altitude. So that field is everywhere and is destroying electronics everywhere. That's what an EMP is. That's what it works. Anyway, that's my best effort to sort of give EMP 101 for those who don't have a degree in electromagnetic physics.
Well, I think that's a good explanation. It's certainly understandable to me. And if it's understandable to me, it should be understandable to most folks. One of the things that I wanted to get into, Dr. Pry, is just exactly how easy it would be to harden our systems against electromagnetic pulse. And I'm talking not only through weapons, but also through the natural solar activities. And I've read various numbers on that, but the highest number that I've read is somewhere around $10 billion to harden our infrastructure in the United States, where we wouldn't have to worry about that. Now, if the cost is so low, exactly why haven't they done something with it? Is there really that much disbelief in the science?
Well, the estimates that are out there range from $500 million to as much as $30 billion. And the EMP Commission estimate is that you could harden the national electric grid for about $2 billion, which is what we give away in foreign aid to Pakistan every year. So if we suspended foreign aid to Pakistan for 1 year, and I don't even know why we give foreign aid to Pakistan. I mean, it's a nuclear weapon state. It hates the United States. They harbored Osama bin Laden, and we give those guys $2 billion a year. But if we suspended foreign aid to Pakistan for just 1 year and spent it on the security of the American people, it would be a giant step toward making the EMP threat go away, which, by the way, is one of the reasons I've dedicated my professional life, and guys like Dr. Graham and Ambassador Woolsey and Ambassador Cooper have been spending their professional lives when they should be in retirement, trying to get the country protected and protect their grandchildren, because this is one kind of a threat that there's no excuse for us to be vulnerable against it. We've known for 50 years how to protect military systems from EMP, and it can be done cost effectively. But you asked me, why haven't we done it? And that's an excellent question. And I've written a whole book explaining that called Apocalypse Unknown, a big, thick book. As a matter of fact, I've written a number of books on this. My first book on it, called Electric Armageddon, explains how to protect the country against EMP. And that book is actually a thin book, okay, because it's easy to protect the country against EMP, and it doesn't cost that much. But the explanation as to why we haven't protected it is so complicated. There's so many reasons that book is a big, thick book, okay? And, I don't want to take up all afternoon describing why, but there's a number of reasons. Let's start with the first one. The fact of the matter is, in my CIA days, when I was working on EMP in the CIA, we couldn't even be talking about this. I mean, it was all deeply classified. And it wasn't until the EMP Commission came along and Dr. Graham decided, we need to declassify this threat. The average American needs to be able to protect himself. The utilities need to be able to protect themselves, but they don't have access to this classified information. So the first really deep unclassified reports, were produced by the EMP Commission basically in 2008. Was our big report that explained how vulnerable all the critical infrastructures are and how to protect them. 2008 wasn't that long ago. That was less than 10 years ago.
Right.
And so a lot of people, even now, don't understand that EMP is not science fiction, that it's a real threat. And unfortunately, we have ended up having to compete with threats that a lot of people correctly regard as science fiction that have been coming out of the government. We've been told by the Obama administration, for example, for 8 years, that we face this thing called climate change and global warming. That's the most serious threat to the United States that exists. And it's not based on good science. It's based on junk science. And, when the U.S. government starts telling you something that's not true, and that people just with common sense can figure out that it's not true, unfortunately, people lose respect for science. They've seen science perverted to political ends. And so they'll say, oh, this EMP, maybe that's just like global warming and it's junk science. Well, it's not. And, so we've tried hard to try to educate people that this is a real threat. It's not a science fiction threat. Then there's an ideological problem. EMP is politically incorrect with the left. It was certainly politically incorrect all with the Obama administration, especially nuclear EMP attack. The Obama administration was willing to talk about a natural EMP threat from the sun. Threats are okay for liberal Democrats and the left if they come from nature, okay? But they don't like threats that come from man. Even if you're North Korea, they see the United States as being at least partially responsible for bad relations with North Korea. And the left also fears and hates the Department of Defense more than they do the North Koreans. They're always, even you can see it in our movies, in the Hollywood left. How many, for every movie that portrays Russia or China or North Korea as the bad guy, there's 10 movies that portray the CIA or American industrialists or the Department of Defense as the bad guy. So it's politically incorrect to talk about EMP threats, and especially nuclear EMP threats, because the left is anti-nuclear. And they would see they see EMP as a conspiracy to get the United States involved in a preventive war against Iran or North Korea. They see it as a conspiracy to encourage the United States to modernize its nuclear arsenal, and that's not the direction the left wants the country to go in. The Obama administration especially wanted to convince people that it was realistic to achieve a world without nuclear weapons, okay? That we could eventually convince Russia, China, North Korea, Iran to give up nuclear weapons. Well, when you can take out a whole country, and part of that agenda was convincing people that nuclear weapons don't have any military utility, okay, that you can't use them. EMP goes completely against that because it shows that even if a country like Iran or a failed state gets hold of one bomb, you know, they could do an EMP attack that could wipe out the United States. That has tremendous utility. And it's very hard to be convincing that nuclear weapons have no utility when you recognize that EMP is a real threat. Then perhaps one of the biggest problems is just corruption, what I would call intellectual corruption that exists in our society. I mean, it used to be that there was more responsibility and more humility in our society. You know, but we live in the age of the instant expert. We live in an age when we have these so-called instant experts on television and in our print media, people who tend to be politically correct on the left, university professors or people that work for left-wing think tanks, and even people who some work for conservative think tanks and the rest. Everybody makes their living by getting their face in the news, on television, or getting quoted in newspapers. And a lot of times their influence increases and the money that flows to them increases if they can make a name in the press. So they have an interest in always being the expert on everything, even when they don't know what they're talking about. And so you have a lot of people, when they're asked a question about EMP, and by the way, most people who in journalism, whether it's in radio or television or press, are ignoramuses when it comes to scientific and technical issues. You know, they have no idea that a person who has a degree in physics is not an EMP expert. You know, that's not even the right credential. You know, you should have at minimum, you know, a degree, a doctorate in electrical engineering with a specialty in electromagnetic pulse physics, and you should have worked or worked for the Department of Defense or intelligence community on classified issues as part of your professional career. You know, there is very few people who have backgrounds like that, but there's hundreds of people who don't know anything about EMP who are willing to misrepresent themselves as experts, you know, and that is a huge part of the problem. And a lot of these people, you know, they outnumber us, people who are real experts, 10 or 100 to 1. And so you get all these myths and misinformation out there about EMP not being a real threat, or that it would be too hard for North Korea to develop a weapon that can make an EMP attack, like they would need a high-yield thermonuclear weapon, which is not true. You know, any nuclear weapon would do, although there are nuclear weapons that are specialized for EMP called super EMP weapons, and North Korea actually probably has one. Just this September, they advertised their hydrogen bomb that they tested successfully on September 2nd as being for super powerful EMP attack, and 2 days later, they released a technical document called the EMP Might of Nuclear Weapons that accurately describes how a super EMP weapon would work. And the mainstream media for the most part, isn't even aware of that. You know, it's enormously frustrating to me that people are still saying that the North Korean nuclear threat to this country has not yet arrived because they can't build a reentry vehicle, supposedly, which is just nonsense. You know, an EMP attack is far more threatening than blasting a city, and you don't need a reentry vehicle. You don't need accuracy to do an EMP attack because the bomb detonates above the atmosphere. Having said that, however, you know, the reentry vehicle angle, reentry vehicles are actually really easy to make. I am personally convinced that North Korea must have a reentry vehicle, because any nation that can build a hydrogen bomb and any nation that can build an ICBM can easily build a reentry vehicle. You know, the reentry vehicle argument was invented by Obama back in 2013 when Kim Jong-un first started threatening to make nuclear strikes on the United States. You know, he had deployed his KN-8 ICBM the year earlier. And Obama told the New York Times on April 16, 2013, I remember that date for reasons I'll tell you shortly, he told the New York Times on April 16, 2013, oh, North Korea can't deliver on those threats because they can't build a reentry vehicle. That was a myth that was created so that the Obama administration wouldn't have to take responsibility for North Korea being able to attack the United States on Obama's watch. He wanted to kick the can down the road so the next president would get blamed, just the way Bill Clinton kicked that the ball down the road, the can down the road. So George Bush got blamed for North Korea being nuclear when it tested in 2006. In fact, North Korea already had nuclear weapons during the Clinton administration, but the press helped cover that up. Now,
I think actually the Clinton administration helped fund some of that.
They did. They gave hundreds of millions, the equivalent of billions of dollars in aid to North Korea. And we're building nuclear reactors to North Korea that would actually have increased their capability to build nuclear weapons by tenfold. All because Clinton, wanted to live in this fantasy world and take political credit for stopping the North Koreans from getting an atomic bomb. And he did get credit. The press gave him credit. I was serving on the North Korea Advisory Group in Congress at the time, and we were warning anybody who would listen that it was all a lie. We could see that North Korea was continuing to build nuclear weapons. What they were trying to do was buy time so they could perfect an ICBM that could reach the United States. It's actually harder to build an intercontinental range missile than it is to build a nuclear weapon, and that's what they didn't have yet. And they were just buying time so that they could perfect the ICBM, which they now have. But they have the ability, in my view, to strike the United States and blast cities if they want with because I'm sure that they've got reentry vehicles. Those are not hard to build. But what I'm most concerned about is an EMP attack, and they've had the ability to do an EMP attack for some time. I just wanted to quickly say, why do I remember April 16th, 2013? Because on the very day Obama was telling the American people, telling the New York Times that Kim Jong-un couldn't strike the United States, the KMS-3 satellite overflew Washington, D.C. and New York City, passed right over Obama's head, at an optimum trajectory to put an EMP attack on the eastern grid. And on that same day, at that same moment, parties unknown attacked the Metcalf transformer substation in California that services the San Francisco Valley, a very important substation that is part of the western grid, with small arms. We still don't know who did that, but it was an incredible coincidence that the eastern grid and the western grid were under simulated attack, one by what looked like a commando operation in the west, and the other one by a nuclear EMP attack by satellite in the east. Now I'll shut up and let you ask another question. I hope I answered some of it.
First of all, I have to say I'm really pleased that you said that about the science behind the so-called global warming. The fact that there are very few legitimate scientists that really do support anthropogenic global warming as the reality that they've tried to make it. So, and we've had a number of folks on this show to talk about that. But Claire, did you ever join our conversation?
Yes, I have been on the line for about 22 minutes, yes.
Okay. Well, good. I'm really pleased to have you on the call. And the reason is because 3 weeksort I had Mary Fanning and Alan Jones were on, and we did a 2-part series on Port Canaveral and the Club K threat that exists in this country. And I know that that's something that you're well tuned in on, and I want to kind of weave that together with the idea of EMP weapons being a real serious concern. And it's the Trojan horse. It's the having literally access to Port Canaveral gives our enemies an opportunity to bring these containers in that are called Club K, and they are actually fitted with various weapon systems. And once they're inside the United States, it would be very difficult to try to determine who is actually responsible for any kind of an attack, because it would be coming from within our country instead of from the outside. So with that, Mary, I'd love to have you kind of fill in some of those connections and how that might also fit in with the EMP threat.
Sure. But this is Clare Lopez, right?
Yes. What did I say?
Mary.
Oh, I'm sorry.
But
Claire, yes, I knew you were on the call. I'm sorry. Just a Freudian slip.
A couple of weeks ago when they were on your show, but just to recap for your listeners, what we're talking about is a container facility lease, 35-year lease, that was granted to a company called Gulftainer back in 2014 by the United States government. And Gulftainer, it turns out, is co-owned by the brother of Saddam Hussein's nuclear mastermind and the Emir of Sharjah, one of the United Arab Emirates. And that company, Gulftainer, that now has this lease at Port Canaveral, Florida, on the Atlantic coast there, up from the Kennedy Space Center, right in the middle of so many important naval and other military bases. Gulftainer is in a joint venture with the Russian company, just as you were saying, that makes and distributes what we call the Club K missile launch system, and that is basically an ordinary shipping container that looks just like every one of the other millions in the world that go on ships, they go on rail cars, they go on semi-tractor trailer trucks, and except this one, the Club K, the lid pops off. And inside are 4 cruise missiles, which can be disguised, can be hidden until that container is wherever the sender wants to put it. Now, the thing about the payload for these cruise missiles is that, and this comes back to what you and Dr. Pry were just talking about, as we now know, Saddam Hussein's bomb maker, the family name is Jafar. It's an Iraqi family. Dr. Jafar actually succeeded in designing a miniaturized nuclear warhead, not produced, not deployed, the best as we know anyway, but designed. And that design could be seen, we think, in a photograph just a few weeks ago, or maybe a couple months, in a photograph with Kim Jong-un, the ruler of North Korea. When your listeners might remember, there was a picture of him posing with a mock-up model of a big round ball. And indeed, that thing is called a beach ball because of its size and its shape. But that is what we were talking about with a miniaturized nuclear warhead that was designed specifically to fit on the top of the cruise missiles that go inside the Russian Club K missile launch system.
Excellent. Well, you described something that would have taken me at least a half an hour to describe in about 5 minutes, and did a terrific job. So thank you, Claire. And I'm sorry, it must be a Freudian slip. I have Mary Fanning on my call so often with this Port Canaveral and the Club K that
no worries.
Yes. Well, believe me, that anytime I refer to anybody in that regard is with due respect. But anyway, with your description there, tell me what you feel about the real impact of having all these potential containers within the United States. We don't know where they are. We don't know if they are. We don't know where they are. But we do know that the capability has been there for some time, and that the company, the Russian company that is designing the Club K, has been working with the same people that have been involved in the Port Canaveral deal. And so there is a huge potential threat there. And I would just kind of like to hear your feelings on how that whole scenario could come together in the form of a terrorist attack that we could not defend against using EMP weapons.
Well, certainly cargo containers are inspected. We have United States officials posted at places abroad where shipping containers are loaded on ships bound for a destination in the United States. That is true. But there's no way they can inspect the millions of cargo containers, that pass through the world's oceans every single day. So that's a problem. But let me mention how this deal slipped through, how this actually happened. And that involves an interagency organization that we call CFIUS. CFIUS stands for Committee on Foreign Investment in the U.S. And it's a multi-agency group that includes, it's headed by the Department of the Treasury, includes Department of Commerce, Department of Transportation, supposed to include the intelligence community, except that under the Obama administration, Director of National Intelligence General James Clapper decided to withdraw the intelligence community from that organization, from CFIUS. And so they were no longer participating or providing insight and information. Whenever a potential lease or a sale of some kind of U.S. facility would come before CFIUS to be reviewed for potential national security implications. And so in the period during the Obama administration, a couple of deals slipped through. The one we're hearing so much about on the news, of course, is Uranium One, and that's got to do with the sale of a certain percentage of America's uranium ore stockpiles or mines, potential uranium supplies. And that's a serious issue that involved, obviously, kickbacks and extortion and all sorts of malfeasance. But it's not an immediate, critical, urgent threat to the survival, the physical survival of the United States of America. If at some point in the future we don't have enough uranium for our needs, that would be a bad thing. But right now, immediately, right now, the United States of America is laid wide open to the threat from the Gulf Tanner deal at Port Canaveral because, as we've talked about, and Mary and Alan certainly did too, these containers could conceivably come into U.S. ports and then from there, as you mentioned, go on to any kind of other transportation, truck or rail, and from there be transported anywhere in the United States. We don't have radar missile defense inside the United States pointed, looking inwards for a launch from inside the continental United States. Such missile defense as we have, and by the way, there's none on the Atlantic or Gulf Coast, but such as we do have, pointing sort of north and west with NORTHCOM and NORAD working together with Canada, is pointed outwards. It was expected always that the threat would come from externally, Russia, China, North Korea, but not from inside the country. We don't have defenses for that right now, and that's an immediate and a critical danger.
Well, and that is the biggest single threat that I see. If in fact there is a potential for an EMP weapon to be used on the inside of the United States, there really isn't any way to defend against it with these Club K containers literally scattered all over the country. And who knows? I mean, like you said, they didn't inspect many of these. Well, I think under Obama, didn't they reduce the inspections to the point where they were almost non-existent?
I don't know the numbers or exactly how many places abroad that we have officials stationed, but the sheer numbers is what I'm getting at of these containers all over the world is the thing. And no, we don't know that any has so far slipped inside the United States, but that's the point. We don't know. And these cruise missiles that are inside the Club K car can carry either a biological warhead, chemical weapon warhead, conventional warhead, nuclear and or EMP warhead, any of the above. And we would never know until it happens.
Right, right. Well, Dr. Pry, I'd like to get you back in the conversation, because I want to have you talk about what we can do, actually what we can physically do to harden our systems, and what can we do in a way that would allow us to be protected against this internal threat as well as the external threat of EMP.
Well, I almost regret coming back online, because I so enjoy listening to Clare Lopez.
Oh, thanks, Peter.
She explains these things so well. It's always a pleasure to listen to you, Clare.
I learned everything I know from you. You know that.
Well, I think both of you do an extremely good job, and obviously we're probably going to run out of time before we get through all the information. So I guess at that point I'm going to ask maybe if you would consider coming back for another program if we do run out of time.
Certainly.
Always a pleasure, of course. Yeah.
Okay, good. All right. Well, let's talk about what we can do to harden our internal systems against EMP.
Sure. The technology's been around a long time, and there's new technologies coming on all the time. We can put surge arresters on generators and transformers, blocking devices, put things in Faraday cages, which is basically just a metal shed with no windows that's specially designed to keep EMP out. You can even make your own Faraday cage if you've got electronic equipment at home that you wanted to protect. If you get a metal garbage can with a tight-fitting lid, and put your electronics inside of a plastic bag. The important thing is the electronics should not come in contact with the metal surface of the garbage can. But if you did that, you've got a Faraday cage, and that would survive even a super EMP weapon. So we know how to protect against it in terms of the technologically, and that's one of the reasons it's been so frustrating, because it doesn't cost that much, and we know how to do it technologically. There's a bigger problem, though, that in terms of protecting ourselves, a failure of strategic imagination that's signified by, I think the Club K is one sign of this, and the North Korean possession of a super EMP weapon that was clearly, I don't think the North Koreans are capable of building the technologies that they have now, hydrogen bombs, ICBMs, super EMP weapons. They didn't do this on their own. They got this from the Russians and the Chinese. And, the bigger question here is not just these technological solutions, which we can implement if the government had the political will to do it and was willing to do it, but facing the reality that we are in a new Cold War. We're in a new Cold War, and we don't even understand that yet. Just like we didn't understand we were in a war with terrorism until 9/11 happened. And this new Cold War has been going on for years. And the other side comprises China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea, who are in a tacit alliance against us. China and Russia have been deliberately proliferating nuclear and missile technology to the bad guys, because the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And this Club K missile is a particular interesting example of that. The Club K is designed specifically to turn third world threats into existential threats against the United States. This kind of a missile that can put in a shipping container, why would you do that? That's so that you can take a country like North Korea or Iran, any failed state, and even if all they've got is a freighter, okay, you can turn that freighter into a missile launch platform.
Right.
And basically that's who they've been marketing it to. They've been marketing the Club K to all our enemies. Iran has got the Club K. So in addition to being aware that, yes, we can fix the grid, and here are some technological fixes I've described, the bigger issue is to understand that we are actually already fighting for our lives in a new Cold War. The Russians, the Chinese, the North Koreans, and the Iranians all know that, but we haven't woken up to that reality yet. We shouldn't be going, for example, to Beijing, hat in hand, begging them to help us with the North Koreans. They're the source of the problem. They're the reason North Korea has got the bomb. Anyway, over to you again.
Well, I have to say that I've taught this, and I've actually had this on some of my programs for a very long time. But the fact is, the Cold War never ended. The Russians just went underground, and the communist system. If you look at what nations in the world are living under communism today, there are so many more than there were in 1991 with the so-called fall of the Soviet Union. And the fact is that communism went underground. It became Yuri Andropov's plan to do it through collusion, through Antonio Gramsci's prison notebooks. You do the whole communist thing by convincing people that communism is dead, that it doesn't exist, and then you just work it like crazy. And right now we've got maybe twice as many nations. When you look at all of Africa, or virtually all of Africa, and much of South and Central America are now living under either very strong socialism or communism. And so, yes, you're right. The Cold War, in my mind, the Cold War never really ended. It just went underground.
And unfortunately, I think we are perhaps on the edge of that ourselves. When you look at our culture and how it has been captured by the left.
Yes.
What kind of a nation are we that we won't defend statues of Columbus, of Thomas Jefferson, and yes, of Robert E. Lee? When we stand there and we watch Antifa tearing down our history in front of our eyes, and with the applause of Hollywood and the mainstream media, and almost nobody out there defending our own history. We see our own culture is under siege right now from the forces of the left and communism, who want to destroy our history, because that's what that's about. They want to try to make us ashamed of our history. And I mean, you never see stories about the fact that California has got a high school named after Che Guevara. Che Guevara, who was at the shoulder during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Che Guevara and Castro were both urging Khrushchev to make a nuclear war on the United States and not give up during the Cuban Missile Crisis, but go to nuclear war. And California has got a high school named after him. And I won't even get into having the statue taking the Ten Commandments out of our courthouses. But Los Angeles thinks it's okay to have a statue to Quetzalcoatl in Los Angeles. What kind of a society are we becoming?
Right. Well, and the fact that Antifa is actually a communist organization, and they're openly communist in their parades. They show the hammer and sickle symbols. They do the clenched fist. I mean, it's obvious that what they're calling anti-fascism is actually communism, and there's not a whole lot of difference between communism and fascism. The big difference is that it's despotism either way, fighting for control of everybody under a socialist system. And that certainly doesn't describe what President Trump is trying to do.
It gets even worse than that. If we understand what Antifa is, and it is a collection of essentially communist organizations, some of which, like the World Workers' Party, openly broadcast support for Kim Jong-un, North Korea, as well as communism, but then think how they are allied in the chaos that's going on our campuses and on our streets inside this country, allied with the Black Lives Matter movement, which was founded by communists, Freedom Road Socialist Organization and others, and the U.S. Muslim Brotherhood, which is explicitly aligned with them as well.
Absolutely.
We call it the red-green axis.
Yeah, not to mention Harvard, Yale, and most of the universities in the United States, which have a hard left orientation. I mean, I can't even begin to tell you about all the hate mail I get from university professors who are teaching international relations, who really think that I'm not being fair and I'm far too critical of countries like Iran and Russia and China and even North Korea. There was a professor from the University of Irvine in California that wrote a particularly scathing letter saying that he hoped North Korea would prevail over the United States because we're such an evil empire. They have a completely twisted view of the United States, which unfortunately is the same kind of view President Obama had when he gave his apology tour in the Middle East. This is what's being taught to our kids. That's why we have to.
I have to say, I think that everything you said is absolutely right on the money, and the fact that so many people in this country, for some reason, think that Vladimir Putin is some kind of a free market capitalist, when in fact he's former KGB, and nothing has really changed in the Soviet Union. Yes, it's called Russia now, but the fact is he's trying to reassemble many of the geographic areas that supposedly ended with the end of communism and bringing them back under his fold.
Well, we're certainly seeing him try to reestablish the glory of Russia, and certainly in the Middle East, opposing any of the influence, the United States, establishing instead his own influence in places like the former Syria, and in alliance there with our mortal enemies, Iran and Hezbollah. Not to mention, in the Ukraine, of course, grabbing Crimea and putting missiles in Kaliningrad, and the Baltics themselves are not all that sanguine either about his intentions. Right,
exactly. Well, I guess what I'd like to do is try to wrap up with a real quick overview of where we've been tonight. Dr. Pry, would you maybe give it a minute or two to talk about some of the things that you're working on and some of the projects that you're involved with, and how the listeners can have an impact on Congress in talking to their congressmen about a way to maybe get a little bit of action on the EMP hardening of our systems.
Well, let me start with the last point first. I would recommend every member of your listening audience, to write their congressman, call their congressman, and tell them to join the Congressional EMP Caucus. The Congressional EMP Caucus is headed by Trent Franks, and that way they can get educated on the threat and become part of the solution. There's actually a lot of knowledge and a lot of support for protecting the country against EMP in Congress. It's unfortunately just a fact that Washington has become so broken that the lobbyists only have to buy one member of Congress or one member of the Senate, the right guy in the right committee, and they can stop a bill from going through or even coming to a vote. But that's the problem. And nonetheless, we should keep plugging away. One of the projects I'm working on is, I'm continuing to run the EMP Task Force on National and Homeland Security. And since the Congressional EMP Commission was terminated on 30 September, that's just another example of the wrong-headedness of how broken Washington is, that just when North Korea has demonstrated that it's a mortal EMP threat to the United States, we terminate the EMP Commission. That just doesn't make any sense. But I and the commissioners are going to continue to fight on from the EMP Task Force on National and Homeland Security. One of the things we do is we're trying to get the states. A number of states are not waiting on Washington, and they shouldn't be. We've been successful in Maine and Arizona and Florida, partially successful in Texas, very successful in Virginia, in getting states to take initiatives. You can protect the grid within your own state. You don't have to wait for the federal government to do it, by putting in the Faraday cages and the blocking devices and the like. A governor, by signing an executive order, with the state legislature, by passing a bill, could start the process going to protect your own state. And so I would encourage people to contact their governor and their state legislators as well and say, we want to get our state protected. And don't forget being prepared in your own family and your own community. We should be doing what the great generation that survived the Great Depression and World War II did. I mean, people deride preparedness as survivalism these days. But really, it's part of our pioneering past to be prepared. Everybody should be prepared. Have a food supply, have a water supply, have a medicine kit and know how to use it. Have a plan for your family if you get yourself in a grid down scenario. You know, this isn't being crazy, and it isn't living in fear either. I think when people know they can take care of I know my own parents were happy people, and that's because they had confidence that they could protect their loved ones and take care of themselves. They didn't have to rely on the government. You know, the people who are always expecting the government to solve all the problems are the ones who live in fear, and they're ones who are always disappointed. Well, I'll shut up now. I'd like to give Claire a chance to.
I do appreciate what you're saying, Dr. Pry, because that, in fact, is the way I grew up too. And you know, it's a situation where if you have some food stored, if you have the ability to survive if the power goes out for a few days or a few weeks, I mean, people need to be just a little bit more far-sighted and understand that we really, you know, all we need to do is a little bit of preparation and we can take care of our own situation. So, Claire, thank you for being on. Would you like to wrap up with some of your thoughts about this and what can be done?
Well, thank you very much for having me. I really appreciate being on and with Dr. Pry. I'd point your listeners to our website at centerforsecuritypolicy.org, or the shorter one goes to the same place, securefreedom.org, where I am the Vice President for Research and Analysis, and in that capacity edit a number of the monographs, the small booklets that we publish at Center for Security Policy. One of those bears directly on these topics we're talking about tonight. In addition to the papers that Mary Fanning and Alan Jones wrote, the first one, by the way, back in December 2016, called What Could Possibly Go Wrong, the first paper about the Gulf-Tainer Port Canaveral deal, and then the second one that came out in October this year, 2017, called The Perfect Storm. But in addition to those, which are both at the website, I'd point them to a monograph we call Guilty Knowledge. And it's just a little paperback that summarizes with the executive summaries of each of a number of congressional studies that have been done over the past 10 dozen years or so on the EMP issue. And that would be very informative, and it's just the executive summaries of the top, I think, 10 or 12 of those studies. I think it'd be very informative for people. And then the last thing would be to do exactly what Dr. Pry was saying, insofar as contacting your local representatives, your congressmen, your senators. But this about the CFIUS, that organization again, the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States. It's not just about uranium-1, far more critical. We've got to get CFIUS back functioning the way it needs to function because of the criticality of the threat with regard to Port Canaveral and the Gulf-Tainer deal, which needs to be canceled. That deal goes for 35 years. It needs to be canceled. Please ask that the president step in and cancel this deal as quickly as possible.
Good. Well, thank you for saying that, and I will definitely mention this to some of the other security people that I knew do listen to our radio show and do have some contact with President Trump. So I thank you for participating, and I ask that you consider being my guest again down the road. We'll maybe we can continue this discussion and get into even more detail on it. But I thank you again for being my guest, and I thank our listeners for tuning in to Connecting the Dots, and ask that you join us again next week. And with that, I'll turn the show back over to Kelby. And thank you, and good night.
Ladies and gentlemen, that concludes this week's show with Connecting the Dots with Dan Happel. God bless. Good night. We'll see you next Thursday, 6 p.m. Pacific.